Yeah, I think it's about time we get started. As usual, I will be inviting everyone to join as a panelist. That way we can see each other's faces and you'll be able to unmute uh, and speak as well. Either reading texts or, answering questions as they come up. Also, as usual, you can put questions in the chat, type them in there, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Dr. Joel Hecker, who is teaching this class on the fluidity of identity in medieval Kabbalah and Kabbalah and medieval philosophy. And yeah, welcome back to those who are returning. And I think there are a couple of new people. Um, and yeah, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hacker.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much, Maxine. And there are times that people need to keep their cameras off for all kinds of, personal reasons and stuff. But it would be great if people want to at least put their cameras on, and so we can see the faces. It's a small group, and so it's not too intimidating. Thanks. And also this time, one thing I'd like to do, because I tend to be somewhat ambitious in terms of ground I like to cover, and also just to juggle things up a bit. If I'll ask if people want to share some of the reading with me, and that way we'll hear some different voices. It'll change the rhythm a little bit. Let me tell you about what I'm hoping that we're for those that weren't here last time. What I'm looking at in these 4 sessions is that there's many ways in which we as 21st century individuals experience ourselves, even the extent to which we might feel ourselves in flux if we are younger, we're early career, or we are mid-career, or there's different aspects of our identities that have changed in one way or another. I know for myself, I became religiously observant towards the end of college, and which dramatically shifted my life course, my career course. But even though there are some of these big changes that take place, for the most part, we experience ourselves as being ourselves, and not as being, in flux or being super vulnerable. And yet there are ways in which we know that through, God forbid, mental illness or physical illness, or drastic life events, is that things can happen that can have an impact on our identities. But there are ways in which, theoretically, the folks that we're looking at last week and through the next few weeks are thinking about what it means to be a human being in ways that are different, that are expansive, and that are aiming at different kinds of transcendence. Last week, we were looking primarily at the example of Hanoch, a biblical figure who, according to ancient midrashic and ancient mystical literature, transforms into an angel, and he becomes the angel Metatron. And we looked at one of the Enoch texts from the Apocrypha, from Hekhalot literature, and we looked at some rabbinic literature about who Metatron is. What I want to be doing tonight is aiming a little higher. If last week we were aiming to become like an angel, is this week we're going to be aiming to become, I titled it Becoming God. And by the end of the hour, we will be looking at people who are talking about actually merging, actually fusing with God, to the extent that there's no difference between one or the other. And for those of you that grew up with conventional ideas of Jewish monotheism, this might shake the cage a little bit, and that's okay. We're here to learn, and we're here to even perhaps have a little bit of fun, and to and expand our understanding of where the Jewish tradition has gone over the course of thousands of years, though I focus mostly on about 1,000 years. So where I want to start is, if you all want to open up the source sheet that I think that Kayla would have sent you today. And we're starting first with one with a non-Jewish figure. His name is Plotinus. And Plotinus is a very significant 3rd century Greek-speaking philosopher who lives in Egypt. And he and his student Proclus are often considered to be the founders of Neoplatonism. I'm just going to say a couple of things about Neoplatonism. It's a hugely influential philosophical movement that in many ways shapes the way that medieval Muslims and then medieval Jews and then medieval Christians thought about some of the most essential issues in religion. Questions of if God is perfect and God is unchanging, how could God create a world? If God is utterly transcendent, how could God be connected to human beings? If God doesn't have a mouth, how could God speak? If God is utterly transcendent, how could God be running the show in any way? And so all of these questions, reward and punishment, prophecy, creation, providence, all get resolved through through the expansion of Neoplatonic thinking. So let me just tell you the very basics of Neoplatonism, and then we're going to read this first passage from Plotinus that deals directly with our topic tonight. One of the most important problems was raised by the ancient Greek philosophers, and then the Jewish philosophers and Kabbalists wrestled with is, if God is infinite and unchanging, how's it possible to create? It would seem like God would have to say, oh, let's change something, let's create something. So we've all heard about Tzimtzum, about God pulling back in order to create space. But the way that Plotinus worked out is he suggested a model that's like the sun, or the way that they used to think of the sun. And in the same way that the sun is radiating light and energy that is life-sustaining forever, according to their understanding, pre-modern understandings, so does God. And that what happens is that in the same way that the sun's rays diminish and become muted as they become distant from the sun, to the extent that they become perfect on this planet, it's quite remarkable. And so that we have the right amount of light, we have the right amount of heat to sustain the life that we have here on Earth. So that is used as a kind of a metaphor for thinking about God, that one couldn't tolerate God's perfection face to face, as it were. But as it travels through, of course, it's not physical space, but as it travels from that distance of transcendence and comes towards nature and humanity, it gets diminished and slowly becomes crystallized. It slowly becomes concretized through a process called emanation. And as it emanates from God and it becomes more and more muted, then our world develops. Lots of solutions to lots of religious problems emerge from that basic model. Any questions? Because I want to make sure that that's clear. We're going to be riding on that basic system for the rest of this evening. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Were you saying this process occurs outside of time? Is that the idea, that and if so, does that cause problems for creation stories?
Yes.
For art creation stories?
Yeah, and so then what has to happen is that an argument has to be constructed to explain how time becomes part of the crystallization process, right? So the initial motion is not willed by God; it happens automatically, and what emanates from God is something. I mean, here we're getting a little into the weeds. Is something called the intellect, and then what emerges from the intellect is something called the soul. But it's in that process that time itself also comes into being. But that's an important philosophical question.
Thanks.
So for our purposes tonight, though, I mean, the truth is the system is important, but where I want to start at the end. because I said that we were going to be talking about thinkers that talk about merging with God. And Plotinus is the first one already in the 3rd century that talks in these terms. And in some ways, he creates the parameters for our whole discussion. So I don't know if somebody up here would like to read that short paragraph. It begins many times. And if not, I can kick it off. Does everybody have it? It says the very first source on the Sepharia source sheet says Plotinus, Egypt, 3rd century, Aeneid's 4th book, chapter 8. He says, many times awakened to myself away from the body, becoming outside all else and within myself, seeing a wonderful and great beauty, believing myself then especially to be part of the higher realm in act as the best life, having become one with the divine and based in it, advancing to that activity, establishing myself above all other intelligible beings, then going down from this position in the divine, from intellect down to discursive reason. I'm puzzled how I could ever and now descend, and how my soul has come to be in the body. So this is a remarkable statement. Anybody have any responses, expressions of shock or wonder, or questions that they want to raise about this source? Right, the main things, perhaps to notice here, and I don't know if it would be helpful for me to, I don't know if everybody got the source sheet. I could certainly share my screen if that would be helpful. But the main things to notice are one, that he says that he has become one with the divine. Okay, so that the way in which Plotinus understands divinity is as something that is not like a hard marble that is impenetrable, but that in some ways, please share screen. Okay. In some way, hold on just a second and I will do that. No?
I think I have to make you, oh, okay, perfect.
Okay. So, oh, that's not that's not right. Sorry. That's not right. That's somebody else's paper that I'm marking up for a volume I'm editing. That was the wrong screen. Just a second. Here it is. It's this one. What screen are you seeing right now?
Yeah, we're seeing it.
You're seeing the right one?
Mhm.
Okay, terrific. Okay, because I'm seeing something that I don't want to be looking at right now. Let's see. Let's get rid of all this stuff. Okay, there we go. Good. Okay, so yeah, so here are the main things, and now I can use my cursor to draw attention to the main points. One is that having become one with the divine, is that this is a divinity that is able to tolerate, that has the capacity to absorb things. And so we have to be understanding divinity not as a closed entity, but also not like a sponge, but rather as somehow something that is all encompassing and yet allows things that somehow are outside of it to be engaged with it at the same time. If that sounds like a paradox, it is. And that's part of the dilemma that theologians have wrestled with, but especially that mystics have wrestled with, is the possibility of coexistence of the infinite and the finite. But here he feels like he's become part of what is infinite. The next piece to draw attention to here is he says he's established himself above all other intelligible beings. What are other intelligible beings? So as we'll see, the Rambam, Maimonides, will refer to those as angels, but really he's just using a biblical word to refer to other intellectual entities that exist in the space, the conceptual space, and the metaphysical space that exists between ourselves and God. So he has now risen to, this is Plotinus, has risen to a level above these other angelic beings. And then going down from that place, notice the stages that he goes to. First, he goes to that position where he's in the divine. down below the intelligible beings, and then from the intellect down to discursive reasoning. This will be the most abstruse piece that we're looking at, but let me just fix the typo here. The way in which probably even many of us experience things is we experience ideas as being somewhat, we get glimmers of ideas and then they become concretized. We start to try, so we talk them out, we write them out, we might sketch them out depending on how we think. For philosophers, especially pre-modern philosophers, there are these stages in which one progresses from a kind of an abstract intellect down to a place where one's engaged in reasoning things out, sentences, logical statements, logical arguments. But then he gets puzzled and he thinks, like, once I was up there, I was with the infinite. How can I come back down? Okay. Plotinus is at the very beginning of the story, and as we're going to see, he's going to be at the end of tonight's story also, or perhaps in next week's class, depending on how far we get right now. Any questions from people seen or unseen? Right, like last week we looked at the verse from Exodus when God said, "You may not see my face." So I feel like, you know, we're having a little bit of that experience this evening. So that's I'm glad to have that that contribution. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we're going to jump ahead to take a look at a passage from Yehuda Halevi. Yehuda Halevi is an important he's an important Jewish philosopher. He lives, as you see, from 1075 to 1141. He's born in Spain. He's born in north central Spain, and then as the Christians start coming in, he moves further down south, and then some radical Muslim forces come into southern Spain, and so then they move back up. He ends up being itinerant and travels around, and he ends his life either most likely in Egypt, although he was trying to get to Palestine at the end of his life. He's one of Jewish history's greatest poets, but he also wrote this very important work of philosophy called the Kuzari. The Kuzari is set up as a description of an event that may be historical, in which the Khazar kingdom was in, you know, today's sort of Caucasus area. And according to the story, according to the historical story, if it is truly historical, at a certain point, he and his entire kingdom converted to Judaism. And in the book, which is somewhat fictionalized, the Khazar king is troubled by a dream, and he feels like he needs to find out what the truth is. And so he sends for a philosopher, and he sends for a Christian priest, and he sends for a Muslim imam, and he sends for a rabbi. And he asks them each to present their story of the truth. And in the end, he's convinced by the rabbi, and the rest of the book is the rabbi's explanation of what Judaism is about. But this passage that I cut out for you is part of the philosopher's statement. And Yehuda Levi, even though there are ways in which he's a philosopher, but to a certain extent, he's using philosophical tools against the philosophers. And in this section, he is presenting part of the philosopher's statement of how God operates in the world. I wonder if there's a brave soul up there on screen that might want to read this section from the Kuzari.
I can read.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maxine.
Okay. In the perfect person, a light of divine nature called active intellect is with him, and its passive intellect is so closely connected therewith that both are but one. The person of such perfection thus observes that he is the active intellect himself, and that there is no difference between them.
Okay, I'm going to give you a break right there. So let me explain to everybody what the active intellect is. In medieval cosmology, and this is sort of a, it's really not worth getting into all the weeds of this because it's a combination of Neo-Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism. But I described how God is emanating God, divine energy, and because they understood the world at that time, the earth, as being as in the center of a series of concentric circles, and the moon was contained in a sphere that circled around us, and then Mars after that, and then Venus after that, a series of these concentric circles that contain these what we understand to be planets. And they understood that their conception was that each one of those spheres had an intellect, some kind of agent that caused it to move. It's as if each one had its own computer program that caused it to turn. And they used that as a way to explain how the different planets moved around. The active intellect that Yehuda Halevi is talking about here, and this is how medieval philosophers talk about it, is the one that supervises our world. So when he says here in that third line that the person of such perfection, and here, we would be talking, if this was a Jewish description of somebody like Moshe, of Moses, thus observes that he is the active intellect himself, that what happens when one rises to a state of individual perfection, of knowing everything that one can know about philosophy in this world, it's like you are that computer program, right? It's as if, imagine if you could download everything about this world into your brain, right? Wait another 10 or 20 years, you'll buy a ticket and you'll stand in line, you'll get the chip, right? And you'll download everything. And that's what we're talking about here. So Maxine, if I could ask you to read a little further, at this degree.
First, could I just ask, who's the speaker right now?
Oh, so this is the philosopher. This is the philosopher explaining to the Khazar king how reality operates and what the purpose of life is.
Okay. This degree is the last and most longed for goal for the perfect man whose soul, after having been purified, has grasped the inward truths of all branches of science, has thus become equal to an angel, and has found a place on the nethermost step of seraphic beings. This is the degree of the active intellect, vis-a-vis that angel whose degree is below the angel who is connected with the sphere of the moon. They're spiritual forces detached from matter, but eternal like the prime cause and never threatened by decay. Thus, the soul of the perfect man and that intellect become one, without concern for the decay of his body or his organs, because he becomes united with the other. His soul is cheerful while he is alive because it enjoys the company of Hermes, Asclepius, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Nay, he and they, as well as everyone who shares their degree and the active intellect, are one thing. This is what is called elusively and approximately pleasure of God.
Okay. So this is an interesting piece, is that here we've got the perfected individual who, in Plotinus, we saw that person was connected with the divine. Here we see that they're connected with the active intellect, which is that agent that is supervising our worlds, but is directly derived from God. And so in a certain sense is an extension of God. But there's other kinds of details here that are interesting. Anything jump out at folks here? I mean, one of the things that jumps out at me is that we see this language that sounds like religious language, right? Like the pleasure of God is that you're going to somehow have a certain experience of something like Ziv HaShekhinah, the glow of Shekhinah, or some such thing. And who are you going to have it with? You're going to have it with these people while you're alive that are long dead. Hermes, Asclepius, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So what is that space that is being occupied? In some ways, it is a different vision It's a philosophical vision of Olam Haba, of the world to come. But the world to come is not something that is going to exist chronologically after we die, but rather it's the way of describing the experience of a certain level of intellectual perfection and a certain state of consciousness. And that when you've attained that state of consciousness, then you're just hanging out with the greats, right? You're like in the Philosophers Hall of Fame. You've just been inducted. I don't know when the awards ceremony or the induction ceremony will take place, but what happens is that then you are experiencing, and he's very careful to hedge. He says, this is what is called elusively and approximately pleasure of God, right? God doesn't experience pleasure, and even the word pleasure could be, misconstrued as a kind of something hedonistic. But there's a certain kind of bliss, a certain kind of ecstasy that they're pointing towards that is aligned with intellectual perfection and that puts you on a par with all the greats. So that is what is being depicted as a philosophical kind of perfection. And from here, where I want to move is I want to move to somebody that, everybody perhaps is familiar with, even if we haven't studied him in depth, is the Rambam, is Maimonides. Any questions on that piece from Halevi?
I'm curious as to how legitimate I guess Yehuda Halevi would have deemed this worldview, his opinion.
Great. So what he's doing here, pardon me, what he's doing here actually, Yehuda Halevi, is that this philosopher is a straw man. He is not propounding his own perspective, and this is a straw man that he's going to take down. So what he's doing is he's got the philosopher saying, here's the perfect guy. Then the Christian priest comes, here's the perfect guy, and so on until the rabbi comes. And when the rabbi gives his presentation, then the Khazar king says, I'm sold. So this is a fictional representation done for that purpose. So Yehuda Halevi is not trying to sell us on this picture. And in fact, from a religious perspective, for most people, this is not exactly what we're aiming for. Right, as we are not aiming for the kind of asceticism that is being described here. And yet we're just going to turn the dial slightly. We're going to see stuff in the Rambam and Maimonides that's going to sound suspiciously familiar to the position that's here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why does he seem so unconcerned with like the body? Like even if my mind contains all of the same information as the active intellect, why would my body not be something that differentiates me from it?
Oh, but so if I'm understanding you correctly, what I want to do for some of the other folks is underlie is point out what I think is underlying your question, which is that for the philosophers, for most pre-modern philosophers, there's a strong, and even like in our own sort of like modern commonsensical way of approaching things, we see that there's a difference, say, between mind and body. Or we might think in terms of soul and body, or intellect and body, or brain and mind. And that gap, that binary, starts off in Plato and in Aristotle in discussions of form and matter. And here I'm going to draw on Plato's model, where forms are eternal. There is an eternal idea of a desk. And the desk that I'm sitting at is just one instantiation of it. There's an eternal idea of human. There's an eternal form of dog, of cat, of whatever. And that everything that we see is a kind of inferior replication or even shadow of that ideal form. If I'm understanding your question correctly, you're asking, why isn't he bothered by the body? And yet, one of the things that we see here is that he says, right over here where my cursor is, Thus the soul of the perfect man and that intellect become one without concern for the decay of the body or his organs. In other words, his body is going to decay. It is going to decay, and it doesn't matter because he has now attained eternal perfection. So what we're seeing here is a life that is dedicated to the mind and to the eternity of the mind, and that ultimately is it's not going to be about neglect of the body, but of ultimately discarding the body.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay. So okay. What I've got, I've got my eye on the time also. What I have next is a whole series of quotations from Maimonides. I'm not going to read through all of them. There's simply too much. But I want to draw attention to a couple of the beginning ones in Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, which is his great legal compendium, and then from his Guide of the Perplexed. Let me just say about Maimonides, or Moshe ben Maimon, or Rambam, is he lives from 1135 to 1204. His family gets chased out of Spain by a different Muslim fundamentalist group, or violent Muslim group, and they end up traveling across North Africa. He settles in Fostat, which is a suburb, as it were, of Cairo in Egypt, and becomes the leader of the Jewish community there, and in many ways becomes the most important thinker from then on in Jewish history. On my medieval thought syllabus, it says simply on that unit where we're covering the Rambam, it says Maimonides is the man. Everybody has to interact with him. Up until today, if anybody, you're going to write any kind of theology, you have to interact with him. If you're going to write any kind of Jewish law, in some way or another, you're going to be interacting with him. He's just this enormously giant figure. What he does in his very important legal work, which he writes at the ripe old age of 35, the Mishneh Torah, is he systematizes all of Jewish law. He takes all of the Talmud with all of its sort of, strange argumentation or roundabout argumentation, and creates this tight, neat system out of all of it. The very first book opens with a series of philosophical assertions, which don't feel like the Bible, and they don't feel like Chazal. In fact, what they feel like is some of the Greek philosophical positions that were just stated by Yehuda Halevi's Kuzari, or by the philosopher in that work. And so I want to just take a look at these first couple, and then we'll jump ahead to the Guide of the Perplexed. One other thing I should say about this is that several decades later, down the road, these works are put under, or are the subject of controversy, several controversies in the international Jewish community. His philosophical work, The Guide of the Perplexed, gets burned at a certain point. And there are prohibitions on studying these first few chapters established by the Rashba until one has attained the age of 25. I'm going to assume that we're all safe, or at least that the long arm of the Rashba can't reach us at this point. At this point, most people are not, most rabbis would tell you it's okay to read this. Okay. So he opens up, the foundation of all foundations and the pillar of wisdom is to know that there is a primary being who brought into being all existence. All the beings of the heavens, the earth, and what is between them came into existence only from the truth of his being. So that's a really startling way to start off a law book, right? Is that this is essentially it's a legal code. And he says the most important thing you have to know is that there's a God, but he doesn't call him God, calls it a primary being, and we'll see other philosophical terms for it. So what happens as a result of talking about God in this way? is what it does is it creates a kind of a clash between what we know when we've been reading, up until last week, every week in the Parshiot about a God who's very active in history, who is described, at least in the narrative, as being able to communicate with people, caring about people, creating agreements with people. And here we're talking about a very abstract identity. Now, in this next one, okay, this is several halachot later, he says, this entity is the God of the world and the Lord of the entire earth. He controls the sphere with infinite and unbounded power. So one of the things that's going to be important to be thinking about here, to keep in mind, is that we talked about God being utterly transcendent, utterly beyond everything. And we also talked about the active intellect who manages our sphere that is beneath the moon, the sphere that contains the earth, and that the active intellect controls. And here the Rambam seems to be talking about both aspects of God at the same time, as the God of the world, meaning of everything, but also as the one that's controlling the sphere. And that ambiguity is going to be very important for the rest of our discussion tonight. And obviously, I can see now continuing into next week. It says this power continues without interruption because the sphere is constantly revolving. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that if it says that this power continues without interruption, could we imagine that posing any kind of a religious problem? Sometimes, especially towards the end of chapter 28 in Deuteronomy, also towards the end of the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, is we get these curses in which it says that God's going to turn away from us. Now, we can very conveniently, adopt a Maimonidean perspective and say, well, the Torah doesn't mean it literally, but what we see here is the Rambam setting the stage for how he's going to resolve the problem. He's setting the stage for us being able to say, here's how God actually works. And now that we know how God actually works, we will then have to explain the Torah and the way the Torah talks about God in light of that philosophical reality. Okay? But we have now created the tension. We're seeing the clash between Athens and Jerusalem, between Greek thought and Jewish thought. And what the philosophers are going to do is that they're going to wrestle with this and come to different kinds of solutions in terms of how they're going to privilege or smooth out some of the issues that arise. Okay. I'm going to skip this next source. I'm going to jump to the most exciting chapter in the Guide of the Perplexed. This is part 3, chapter 51 of the guide. If you ever want to impress people at cocktail parties, you can just say, oh yes, well, that reminds me of part 3, chapter 51 of the Rambam's Guide of the Perplexed, and they'll be dazzled. You'll be just like Kyle DeChannel. You'll be able to get tens of millions of dollars to invest, etc. Okay, so really, what would be ideal is for us to read this entire chapter, or even the excerpts that I've got here. I think in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is, I'll imagine maybe you took a look at, some of you might have taken a look this afternoon, or you can take a look at subsequently. But I do want to start with this parable that he sets up at the beginning of the chapter. Is there a brave soul that would like to read this? This is where it says part 3, 51-2. I will begin the subject.
I can read it.
Great, thank you, Noah.
I will begin the subject of this chapter with a simile. A king is in his palace, and all his subjects are partly in the country and partly abroad. Of the former, some have their backs turned towards the king's palace, and their faces in another direction, and some are desirous and zealous to go to the palace, seeking to inquire in his temple and to minister before him, but have not yet even seen the face of the wall of the house. Of those that desire to go to the palace, some reach it and go round about in search of the entrance gate. Others have passed through the gate and walk about in the antechamber, and others have succeeded in entering into the inner part of the palace and being in the same room with the king in the royal palace. But even the latter do not immediately on entering the palace see the king or speak to him. After having entered the inner part of the palace, another effort is required before they can stand before the king, at a distance or close by, hear his words, or speak to him.
Okay. Okay. What Maimonides is going to, thank you very much. What Maimonides is now going to do with this parable is he's going to parse it. He's going to identify, he's going to match up what kinds of people match up with these different figures from the parable. So let me take you through his explanation. He says, I will now explain the parable which I have made. The people who are abroad are all those that have no religion, neither one based on speculation nor one received by tradition. Such are the extreme Turks that wander about in the north, the Cushites who live in the south, and those in our country who are like these. I consider these as irrational beings, and not as human beings. They are below mankind, but above monkeys, since they have the form and shape of man, and a mental faculty above that of the monkey. So even though the Rambam has been the most influential thinker, fortunately not all of his ideas about different people in the world have continued with him. But I think that what is important to see here is how pervasive intellectual ranking is as a way of establishing a hierarchy amongst human beings as far as the Rambam is concerned. And so the people who are abroad, who don't even know that there's a palace, those people are just like, they can't be helped. Nothing's to be done with them. The next group are the group that have their backs turned towards the king's palace, are those who possess religion, belief, and thought, but happen to hold false doctrines, which they either adopted in consequence of great mistakes, or they received from others who misled them. Because of these doctrines, they recede more and more from the royal palace, the more they seem to proceed. And these are worse than the first class, and under certain circumstances may become necessary to slay them and to extirpate their doctrines in order that others should not be misled. We may well be thankful that we don't follow the Rambam on this either. But here what's interesting, or let me ask it as a question, is there anything striking about this categorization in relationship to the first one? Is one of the things that we're seeing here is that having the wrong ideas is dangerous for civilization. Perhaps living in 2024, we shouldn't be so surprised. We're not so surprised to be seeing that having the wrong kinds of ideas could be dangerous. But usually we don't think about them as having the wrong ideas about God. Although maybe if you think that, well, you should exterminate a whole people, that God thinks that you have to go exterminate a whole people, you might think that that's a dangerous person, that that's a dangerous idea to be thinking about God. But let's get closer to where we're trying to get to tonight. So the next piece says, those who desire to arrive at the palace and to enter it, but have never yet seen it, are the mass of religious people, the multitude that observe the divine commandments but are ignorant. Okay, so here are all of the poor Slavs who show up at shul every single week, maybe even every single day. And where are they? They want to get there. They want to get to the king's palace, but they still haven't seen it. And even though they are keeping all of the mitzvot, because they haven't studied philosophy, they're lost. Okay, hopefully I haven't lost everybody here. But you're going to see where I want to get to. Then there are those who arrive at the palace, go around about it, and they are those who devote themselves exclusively to the study of the practical law. So now we're talking about serious rabbis Okay, we are talking about Talmidei Chachamim, sages, poskim. They believe traditionally in true principles of faith. In other words, they accept principles of faith based on tradition, right? They believe traditionally in these true principles of faith. The rabbi said it to them, their parents said it to them, they follow it. They learn the practical worship of God. In other words, they learn how to do the mitzvot, they learn how to pray, but they're not trained in philosophical treatment of the principles of the law. So in other words, they can say, oh, the main point of Judaism is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. They can say God has unity, there's only one God, et cetera, et cetera. They can sort of parrot all of these things, but they don't really understand what they mean. And because they don't endeavor to establish the truth of their faith by proof, they're still outside. The next ones are the ones that get into the antechamber. And then there are those who succeed. Here I am in section 8, in finding a proof for everything that can be proved, who have a true knowledge of God so far as a true knowledge can be attained. They're near to the truth wherever it's possible, and they are in the palace in which the king lives. Then he goes on and he talks about how, how are you going to get there? You have to study mathematical sciences and logic. You have to understand physics, natural philosophy. Then you master metaphysics. Then you've entered the innermost court and you're with the king in the same palace. And then look at where you are. You've attained the degree of the wise men, who include men of different grades of perfection. This sounds just like Yehuda Halevi, right? Except that with Yehuda Halevi, it was a straw man, right? He was saying, oh yeah, you're going to be with, you'll be with Socrates and with Plato and with Aristotle. Well, that's what the Rambam is saying here. You've attained that same degree. Now, remember that in the Kuzari, when we were looking at him, he was saying that this is even after your body has passed away, right? It says, you'll have no concern for the decay of your body. We don't seem to be there just yet, but let's see where the Rambam's going. Because now he talks, I referred to Moses before, to Moshe. He says, one of these who has attained this high level has attained so much knowledge, has concentrated his thoughts to such an extent in the idea of God that it could be said of him, and he was with the Lord 40 days. So remember last time when we were talking about Moshe, and we were talking about transcending the limits of the human body, and according to the biblical description, he's up on the mountain for 40 days, 40 nights, doesn't eat, doesn't drink. There's no human being alive today that could do such a thing. I'm not a biblicist, so we're not going to go into how the Bible might have understood that. The Bible understands it, the Torah understands that as a miracle. But philosophers need to explain it. And here he says, during that Holy Communion, he, that is Moshe, could ask him, that is God, answer him, speak to him, be addressed by him. And why is all this happening? His intellectual energy was so predominant that all coarser functions of the body, especially those connected with the sense of touch, were in abeyance. Okay, so we're coming back to where we opened with Noah's question of like, well, what about the guy's body? And here he's saying, the Rambam's saying, who cares? That's not the point. The point is this transcendence. But I was promising you like something a little bit bigger than this, right? I was promising you that, we're going to be transcend the fluidity of identity. So as he says, let's return to the subject of this chapter. He goes on for a little bit and critiques people that just talk about God, that don't really know what they're talking about. But I want to get to, here we go. I want to get over here where we're going to talk about how you're going to get to that point of a kind of assimilation into the active intellect the Rambam will be describing. He says it has been shown that it must be a person's aim, after having acquired the knowledge of God, to deliver oneself up to God and to have one's heart constantly filled with longing after God. A person accomplishes this generally by seclusion and retirement. He says it in a different passage here that it takes years of contemplation during the Shema, during the daily prayers, of contemplating God's being in order to get to this state. And so every pious person should therefore seek retirement and seclusion. See how long your spouse likes that, or your kids. And should only in case of necessity associate with others. Okay. So with 7 minutes left, I want to get to the main part here. And that begins right over here. It says note. Every once in a while he breaks down the fourth wall and he says note. I've shown you that the intellect which emanates from God onto us is the link that joins us to God. You have it in your power to strengthen that bond if you choose to do so. It sounds like Mission Impossible. Or to weaken it gradually till it breaks, if you prefer this. It will only become strong when you employ it in the love of God and seek that love. Okay, and so he goes on to talk about how you have to be constantly setting God before Shivit Hashem lenegdi tamid, having God always in front of you. He goes on to give these instructions. He's talking about reading the Shema and Tefillah, etc., that I've been telling you about. And about how when you're by yourself, you should be just meditating. But here's the main point. When we have, because I see we've got 5 minutes left. When we have acquired a true knowledge of God and rejoice in that knowledge in such a manner that while speaking with others or attending to our bodily wants, our mind is all that time with God. When we're with our heart constantly near God, even while our body is in the society of other people. And he continues and he says, we will have then attained the stature of Moses, right? And he goes on to talk about, let me go a little bit further. He goes on to talk about providence and about how one is always protected by God, but that it doesn't mean that you're protected, God forbid, from a car hitting you. It just means that it wouldn't make a difference if your mind is with God, because that's where the eternity is. And here we come to what will happen to the body and how the ultimate connection gets attained. It says the philosophers have already explained how the bodily forces of a person in their youth prevents the development of moral principles. And a person can by no means attains this so long as their bodily humors are hot. But as the forces of the body are weakened and the fire of passion quenched, in the same measure does a person's intellect increase in strength and light. The knowledge becomes pure and a person becomes happy with their knowledge. And then when they become near death, the knowledge mightily increases. And what happens is that the barrier, the shield, the veil that blocks our mind from the divine mind starts to slip away. And that's the moment that the soul separates from the body. He then goes on to refer to a famous passage from the Talmud in Bava Batra, where it talks about how Moshe and Aaron and Miriam all died by a kiss. Because with Moshe and Aaron, it says that they died al pi Hashem, by the mouth of God, which the rabbis and the Talmud explained that they died by a kiss, meaning that it was as gentle as a kiss, as their soul separated from their body. But what's happening for the Rambam at that moment is that that is the moment at which their knowledge of God is strengthened as death approaches. And in fact, just look a couple lines above it, where it says, this kind of death, which in truth is deliverance from death, has been ascribed by our sages to none but Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. So let's fold all of this together. What is the Rambam saying here? Is that at the moment of death, the person that has been constantly contemplating God through their life and carefully developing their knowledge and understanding of God and has purified themselves of all extraneous thought, it doesn't matter when they die, not because their soul is connected to God, but rather their intellect is now conjoined with the active intellect, with that sphere that runs this world. But I referred to an ambivalence before, or rather an ambiguity before. Remember from the very beginning of the Mishnah Torah, are we talking about God or are we talking about the active intellect? In that second halakha, the Rambam seemed to be blurring them. First, in one line it says one, the other line says the other. And one of the remaining mysteries with the Rambam is what level exactly does one attain? Is one conjoining with the active intellect that just manages this world? Or is it actually with God? Questions, comments?
For one who reaches this state, the idea is that they're so identical with the active intellect that they keep living, right?
I'm sorry. Say it one more time. I was looking at the chat, so I got distracted.
Oh, no worries. I was just saying, for one who reaches this state, the idea is that they're so identified with the active intellect that they keep living, right?
Correct.
So, is there room for individuality in that? Is there room for me to keep living?
So, the way that people have read the Rambam is that but that doesn't matter. We like you, Noah, but in the end, it's your knowledge of eternal truth that gets the eternity for you. And I want to come to Ozzy Orbach's question. He says, Maimonides does not say you can become one with God. And I concede that we've gone fairly quickly through these passages. If you go through the handout, I think what you'll see is that I understand the objection, and absolutely. Last week, one of the first verses that we looked at was the verse from chapter 33 in Exodus, where it says you can't see God. One of the things that medievals are pushing up against is they're pushing up against this boundary. Okay. Well, there is logic to it, and that's the reason that people say all the Rambam's saying is that you could become unified with the active intellect. But think back to the system of emanation that we began with, and those series of emanations are of God. Now, we're going to see this more when we get to the Kabbalists next week, and that's where we'll start next week. And next week, what I propose is that we'll start with the continuation of tonight's class, looking at the Kabbalistic part, and then we'll start reincarnation. But with the Rambam, it may well only be that it's with the active intellect. And the question with the Rambam is, well, is the active intellect, can you actually talk about that as being in relation to God? So following Ozzy, there are many who would say the Rambam agrees. And there are some who say that it seems like when you read the Rambam carefully, that there's actually a possibility of transcendence. So the single parenting has returned. I'm going to have to get off off tonight's call. I'm happy to pick this up next week. And next week, what we will look at is we will take a look at the remaining sources that I wanted to do tonight: Azriel of Gerona, Yosef Chikatilia, and then a couple of passages from Avram Abulafia before we turn to the Zohar on reincarnation, and after that to later sources of reincarnation. If folks want to shoot me an email to ask questions, I'm happy to get back to you. You can reach me at jhecker@rrc.edu, or my first name last name at Gmail, joel.hecker@gmail. Have a good night, everybody. Have a good week. Hope to see you next week. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for your contributions. Looking forward to seeing you again next week, and maybe in some other classes in this spring Sman. Thank you. Good night.